Figure it out yourself, Mom. We can't keep doing this. That's what my son said to me on the phone, his voice flat and impatient, like I was a problem he was tired of solving. So I did exactly what he told me to do. I figured it out myself. All $2.1 million of it. And then I left, and I never told him where I went. My name is Nancy Sullivan. I'm 72 years old, and I've lived in Vermont my entire life. Before I tell you what brought me to that decision, I want to know where you're watching from tonight. Drop your city or state in the comments below. I always wonder who's out there listening to a story like mine. Let me take you back to where all of this began. I married my husband Harold when I was 21 years old in the same small congregational church where his funeral would be held 47 years later. He worked as a machinist at a manufacturing plant outside Burlington for almost 40 years, steady hands, steady paycheck, the kind of man who never once called in sick in 4 decades, who left before dawn every single morning and came home smelling like machine oil and sawdust. I stayed home raising our 3 children and took in bookkeeping work for a handful of small local businesses to help make ends meet, working at our kitchen table after the kids were asleep, a lamp burning late into the night over stacks of ledgers. We weren't wealthy people. We were careful people. We paid off our small farmhouse by the time I was 45, and every extra dollar Harold and I ever earned went straight into savings and investments he researched meticulously at our kitchen table every Sunday night with a legal pad and a cup of coffee, teaching himself the stock market the same patient way he taught himself to rebuild an engine. We had 3 children. Amanda was our oldest, born when I was 23, sharp and organized from the time she could walk, the kind of child who alphabetized her books before she could properly read them. Ryan came next, quieter, always tinkering with something in the garage, just like his father, taking apart the toaster more than once just to understand how it worked. And Katie, our youngest, arrived when I was 33, the baby of the family who could talk her way out of anything, all dimples and quick excuses even as a toddler. I gave those children everything I had. I was the room mother every single year. I drove Brian to hockey practice at 5 in the morning through Vermont winters that would make your bones ache, the windshield frosted over so thick I had to scrape it with a credit card most mornings. I sewed Katie's prom dress by hand because the one she wanted cost more than we could justify staying up 3 nights running to get the hem exactly right. I sat through every science fair, every recital, every parent-teacher conference, always in the front row, notebook in hand, cheering loudest of anyone in the room. Harold died on a Tuesday morning in February 12 years ago. He was 67 years old. He'd gone out to shovel the driveway after a heavy snow the way he did every winter of our marriage, and he collapsed right there in the snow. I found him from the kitchen window. Massive heart attack, the paramedics told me later, probably instant. I ran outside in my socks and held his hand in the snow until the ambulance arrived, though I already knew somewhere underneath the panic that he was gone. The funeral was held at the small congregational church we'd attended for 40 years, and it was packed, nearly 250 people, because Harold had quietly helped half the town at one point or another, fixing a neighbor's car for free, loaning tools, teaching kids in the neighborhood how to work with their hands. My 3 children stood beside me that day, and Amanda held my hand through the whole service and told me, "Mom, we're not going anywhere. We'll take care of you." I believed her completely. For the first year after Harold passed, my children were wonderful. They called constantly. They took turns staying with me on weekends. Brian kept the driveway plowed every single snowfall, refusing to let me hire anyone. Katie called me every single morning just to hear my voice. I thought, this is what family does when everything falls apart. We hold each other up. If you've ever believed your children when they promised they'd always be there, and then slowly watched that promise dissolve into nothing, I want to know. Tell me in the comments what that felt like for you, and if this story is resonating with you so far, please hit that subscribe button. It helps me keep sharing stories like mine with all of you. Then gradually, the way these things always seem to happen, things began to shift. Amanda made partner at her accounting firm in year 2, and her weekly calls became bi-weekly, then monthly, always with a genuine sounding apology attached that somehow never translated into more actual time. "Mom, it's just insane right now," she'd say. "I promise I'll call more once things settle down." Things never quite settled down. Brian and his wife bought a bigger house across the state line in New Hampshire in year 3, nearly 2 hours away, instead of 20 minutes. The Saturday driveway visits that used to be routine slowly becoming a special occasion instead. Katie married a man named Derek who worked in finance in Boston, and within a year, she'd moved 4 hours south, visits shrinking from monthly to a handful of times a year, mostly around the holidays, mostly brief. I told myself this was simply what happened as children built their own lives. I stopped expecting daily calls. I stopped assuming I'd be included in every decision, every milestone, every ordinary Tuesday evening the way I once had been. I adjusted the way mothers learn to adjust, quietly without complaint, telling myself the love underneath it all hadn't actually changed, even as the distance kept growing wider every single year, one missed birthday and one rescheduled visit at a time. Year 5 is when I truly understood how far that distance had grown. I had a fall in my own kitchen in January, slipping on a patch of ice that had tracked in from the back door, and I broke my hip. I lay on that kitchen floor for nearly 40 minutes before I managed to drag myself inch by agonizing inch to the phone on the counter, my hip screaming with every movement, the cold linoleum leaching the warmth right out of me. The ambulance took me to the hospital in Burlington, and from that hospital bed, alone and terrified, waiting to hear whether I'd need surgery, I called all 3 of my children, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone steady. Amanda's phone went straight to voicemail. Brian answered but told me he was right in the middle of something at work and would call me back that evening. He didn't call until the next morning. Katie didn't respond to my message until nearly 24 hours had passed, a short text that read, "Oh no, Mom, that's awful, keep me posted." Not one of them got in a car. Not one of them came to sit with me while I waited for surgery, alone in a hospital room, listening to machines beep through the night, staring at the ceiling tiles, wondering if this was simply what the rest of my life was going to look like from here on out. If you've ever needed the people you raised to show up for you and heard nothing but silence and excuses instead, I want to know how that felt for you. And if this story is helping you feel less alone in something similar, that's exactly why I keep telling these stories every week. After my hip healed, I started paying much closer attention to the pattern of our conversations, instead of quietly making excuses for them the way I'd been doing for years. When any of them did call, I noticed the questions had a way of circling back to the same places. Amanda started asking about Dad's old investments and whether I'd ever consolidated them properly. Brian brought up estate planning more than once, unprompted, suggesting I really ought to get everything organized so things would be easier down the road. Katie mentioned more than once how big the farmhouse must be for just me now, how much upkeep it must require, how nice it might be to simplify. I realized slowly, and then all at once, that my house, paid off decades ago, and now worth considerably more than we ever imagined, along with Harold's carefully built investments, made me worth far more than any of my children fully understood. And once that understanding started to dawn on them, even faintly, their occasional attention came wrapped around questions that had nothing to do with how I was actually doing. Year 8, I called a family meeting, not in person, but a 3-way call, because by then I understood better than to expect anyone to drive up to Vermont for a conversation that wasn't strictly necessary. I told them I'd been feeling isolated, that I was getting older, that I needed to know I could genuinely count on them if something serious happened again. I brought up the hip, the empty hospital room, the fear of lying alone on my kitchen floor, not knowing if help was coming, my voice shaking slightly as I said it out loud for the first time. Amanda cut me off almost immediately. "Mom, please don't start this again." Brian's voice had an edge I'd rarely heard from him, sharp and clipped in a way that didn't sound like the boy I'd raised. "We have our own lives, Mom. We can't keep dropping everything." I told them I wasn't asking anyone to drop everything, only asking if I mattered enough for them to show up when it truly counted, when it wasn't convenient, when it actually cost them something. There was a long, heavy silence on that call, the kind that stretches out and makes you wonder if the connection has dropped entirely. And then Brian said the words that have stayed lodged in my chest ever since, delivered flat and final, like he'd rehearsed them in his head more than once before finally saying them out loud. "Mom, you're healthy, you're not helpless, you have money, you have a beautiful house. Figure it out yourself. We can't keep doing this. Figure it out yourself." 50 years of motherhood distilled down into 4 words from my own son. Would you have broken down right there on that call or found the strength to stay quiet the way I did? I'd love to know in the comments. And if you've ever been told by your own family to simply figure it out yourself, please hit that subscribe button, because what happens next is exactly what they deserve to hear about word for word at a table they never expected to be confronted at. I didn't cry on that call. I hung up, sat alone in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd once lain broken on the floor waiting for help that never came from them, and something in me went very quiet and very clear. If they wanted me to figure it out myself, then that's precisely what I intended to do. The next morning, I called my attorney, a man named Peter Whitcomb, who had handled Harold's estate 12 years earlier. Good man, thorough, no nonsense. I sat in his office and told him everything: the hospital stay, the pattern of financial questions disguised as concern, and finally Brian's exact words on that call. Peter listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he set down his pen and said, "Nancy, let's talk about what you actually want to leave behind, separate from what they assume they're entitled to." Over the following months, Peter and I restructured my entire estate. We met 6 separate times, working through every account, every asset, every possible scenario, because by then I understood that doing this properly meant leaving absolutely no opening for anyone to challenge it later. First, the will. I removed all 3 of my children as primary beneficiaries. Peter warned me they would likely contest it, claiming diminished capacity or undue influence. Let them try, I told him. I have 3 years of documented calls and voicemails that tell the real story. We restructured my $2.1 million in total assets, the house, Harold's investments, my own savings, in a way designed to be airtight. 40% went to the Vermont Veterans Home, because Harold's own father had spent his final years there, cared for with a dignity I never once received from my own children in my own moment of need. 30% went to a scholarship fund for first-generation college students at the University of Vermont, because Harold had always talked about wanting to help kids who worked as hard as he once had to earn their place. 20% was split among my 6 grandchildren, placed in trust until each of them turned 30, with one clear condition: that they maintain a genuine documented relationship with me, not their parents, but with me, directly verified through Peter's office, with logged visits and calls, not obligatory holiday photographs. The remaining 10% went to my neighbor Ruth, a widow herself, who had driven me to every single physical therapy appointment after my hip surgery, without ever once being asked, showing up in her old sedan every Tuesday and Thursday for 4 straight months. The farmhouse itself went into an irrevocable trust, structured so that upon my death it would be sold, and the proceeds distributed exactly as I designated, with no path for my children to inherit it directly or contest the arrangement afterward. Peter made absolutely certain of that, walking me through every possible avenue a lawyer might later try to exploit, and closing each one methodically, the same careful, patient way he'd once handled Harold's estate 12 years earlier. For nearly a year, I told my children nothing had changed, mostly because there was nothing to tell them. They weren't calling anyway, so there was no conversation to have. Instead, I started genuinely living. I joined a watercolor class at the community center in town. I began volunteering twice a week at the same small library where I'd taken my own children as toddlers. I made real friends, women who wanted to sit with me over coffee because they simply enjoyed my company, not because they were quietly waiting to see what I might eventually leave behind. Then, almost exactly 3 years after that phone call, everything shifted again. Amanda called me out of nowhere on a Sunday evening, her voice suddenly warm in a way I hadn't heard in years. "Mom, I've been thinking about you so much. We really should get together soon, don't you think?" I asked her plainly why now, after years of near silence. There was a long pause, and then the truth came tumbling out. Brian's father-in-law, who worked in local real estate, had mentioned that Vermont farmhouse property values in our area had nearly tripled, and that, combined with whatever Dad's investments had grown into over a decade, meant I was likely sitting on considerably more than any of them had ever realized. Suddenly my children remembered they had a mother. I invited all 3 of them to the farmhouse for Sunday dinner. The first time in years all 3 had been under my roof together. I cooked everything myself, the way I always used, to a pot roast and fresh bread, and the apple pie Harold used to love, and set the table with Harold's mother's china, the pieces I'd only ever brought out for the biggest occasions. When they arrived hugging me, complimenting the house, asking careful circling questions about how I'd been managing everything on my own, I let them get comfortable before I brought out the folder Peter had helped me prepare 3 years of documented calls, voicemails, and Brian's own words from that phone call, transcribed exactly as he'd spoken them, printed and dated, and organized the way Peter had taught me. I read his own sentence back to him at that table, my voice steady, even as my hands trembled slightly around the folder's edge. Mom, figure it out yourself. We can't keep doing this. Brian's face went pale, the color draining out of it the way it used to when he was a boy caught in some small lie. Amanda stared at the folder without touching it, her fork frozen halfway to her plate. I told them calmly exactly what I'd done, the trust, the will, the conditions attached to their own children's inheritance, and not theirs, the fact that the farmhouse would never be theirs to sell or divide no matter what happened after I was gone. Katie began crying, the same tears she'd used to get her way since she was a little girl, tears that no longer moved me the way they once had back when a single tear from her could undo any punishment Harold and I ever tried to enforce. Brian stood up so quickly his chair scraped hard against the floor. You can't do this to us. We're your children. I looked at him and said the truest thing I've ever said in my entire life. You told me to figure it out myself. I did exactly that. I'm simply the one who finally listened to you. Amanda, to her credit, didn't shout or cry. She just sat very still, staring at that folder, and said quietly, almost to herself, we really said that to her, didn't we? It wasn't quite an apology. It was closer to one than anything either of her siblings managed that entire evening. They left without dessert that night. Amanda called 2 days later, her voice small, asking if we could talk honestly, not about money, but about what had actually broken between us. I told her I needed time. It's been 8 months since that dinner, and Amanda and I have spoken a handful of careful, honest times since, conversations that might someday become something real again. Brian hasn't called once. Katie sent one long email accusing me of keeping records like she was some kind of criminal, which told me everything I still needed to know about whether she understood what she'd done to me. I won't sit here and tell you this story ends with a perfect, tearful reunion, because it doesn't, and I promised myself a long time ago I'd only ever tell you the truth in these stories. Some days I grieve the family I believed I had for so many years, the one I spent decades building, meal by meal, ride by ride, sacrifice by sacrifice, right alongside that little farmhouse Harold, and I paid off dollar by careful dollar. Most days I'm simply grateful for the life I've built since that phone call. Ruth on my porch most mornings, with her arthritic hands wrapped around a coffee mug. My watercolor class every Thursday afternoon, where I finally learned to paint the mountains I've looked at my whole life. The library patrons who greet me by name every single week and ask about my grandchildren without ever once asking about my money. I gave my children everything I had for decades, every sleepless night, every dollar I could spare, every ounce of myself I had left to give. And when I finally needed even a small fraction of that back, I was told to figure it out myself. So I did exactly that. And in doing exactly that, I finally built a life that no longer depends on their permission, their presence, or their approval to feel whole. I'm Nancy Sullivan. I'm 72 years old, and after my own son told me to figure it out myself, I figured out $2.1 million, and I left, and I have never once looked back.